All right, now we are ready to look at the J exercises. First, stop this video and carefully read J first, because this is not the kind of thing where it would be any good for me to lecture you on what all the different fallacies are. The reading covers that very well. So the strategy here is to simply learn by looking at the examples and talking about them. It is also important that you have out page 11, where I define in basic terms each of the fallacies, so you can keep pausing the video and try to answer each example while you're looking at your homework to see how you're doing. I will, and this will be both great and just silly, I will be mimicking class discussion by having, wait till you see them, some participants giving right and wrong answers so we can talk about different fallacies that you might be confused about. Also, after we give the answers for each part one of each of the examples, I will then show you what the good answers are and also how I will grade that. Because as we learned in video number 1, I am looking for the primary technique that's working the most in the example, and then also for, if they're there, secondary techniques. And so I'll show you how I will give the bulk of the credit to the primary technique, and the last bit of credit to get full credit will come from finding the most important secondary techniques. So I'll be listing those at the bottom as you see me keep doing. Good? All right, we're ready to start. Example A. Everyone should support the death penalty. Either you kill the murderers or tell them to go and kill some more. This one's fairly straightforward. Yes. Eyeleen. Yes, that's right. This is the black and white fallacy. So a black and white fallacy is taking an issue that's complicated, has several options, and acting as if there's only two options. You can either kill them or let them go. George, please. That's a good attempt. Let me explain why it's not a euphemism. A euphemism is when you use a word in a way that's misleading to your audience. So if you use a word and it makes the thing sound better than it is, or its opposite is a dysphemism, that's when you use a word to make the audience think it's worse than it is. Let's do a little tangent on euphemisms. So euphemisms, think of what are your favorite euphemisms for prostitute? Great. Yes, exactly. Oh, sorry, George. Another guess? Equivocation. No, equivocation is when you take a word and during your argument you change its meaning, like you rely on a word meaning that can be a little slippery. So for example, if I tell someone that I'm a socialist and they have a completely different definition than me, they might base their argument on that slippery definition. So they will say, oh, you like socialism, so you want everyone's ideas and freedoms completely controlled by the government. No, that is a different meaning than what I would use, so you're equivocating on the word socialism. Any other guesses? Yes, good, right? I do think the secondary technique here is straw man. Now, think of the metaphor of straw man to make that one clear. Think of a prize fight. If you are wanting to be an MMA fighter or a boxer and you want to prove that you are a good fighter, what do? You have to defeat the best contender or the strongest contenders to the title. You don't go out there and beat up a bunch of 4-year-olds because this doesn't make you look good. Well, a straw man argument is when, instead of attacking your opponent's real position, you turn their position into a joke version of it so that it's easier to attack. So notice, in this case, do you really think that people who oppose the death penalty really think that we should just let murderers go so that they can kill some more? That's not their actual position. That is just attacking a straw man version of their actual position. George? Yes. I would say that there is a little bit of fear here, right? So that would be a really good guess that would help your answer a little. So to summarize A, if you put black and white fallacy, that would get you the bulk of the credit. And then if you also put straw man fallacy, that would get you the remainder of the credit. That would be a great answer. If you also put fear, that helps your answer a little bit as well. All right, so let's look at number B. In B, it says, what? Now I can't smoke in restaurants? This is going too far. Pretty soon, smokers are going to be liable for damaging the health of their own kids with secondhand smoke in the privacy of their own homes. Let's try. Okay, George. Yes, good, George. There is some fear at play here, making you afraid of the takeover of the government or the loss of our rights. So there is some, it looks to be exaggerated fear. Good. Yep, that's right, that's right. In this case, you could say it's not obvious, but there is some, and by the way, George, we pronounce it hyperbole. I know it's spelled hyperbole, but it's a weird word pronounced hyperbole, and that just means something that's an exaggeration to the point of being incredibly unbelievable, right? So not just a mild exaggeration. Hyperbole is when it's an impossible exaggeration. Eyeleen? Yes, the primary technique here is slippery slope. A slippery slope is when you start with one event and you fear this chain of causes that's going to happen. So you take the first step, and this is going to lead to all of these disastrous consequences down the road. So to review B. For B, slippery slope would get you the bulk of the credit. That's the primary technique. Fear is the secondary technique, and I would also give a little credit if someone put hyperbole, but again, I wouldn't be looking for that example. That one's pretty subtle. All right, let's look at example C. One of my favorites. I won't try that workout supplement. 2 guys took that and their junk shriveled. Let's see. George? Yes, okay. I could see why someone would think this is false cause. And the false cause isn't really there, but I could see that our brains would go there. Because what we're thinking is, what could be the other possible causes of, forgive me for saying this, shrunken junk? That's a good rhyme. And so it's not really stated, right, what the cause is. There's really a different technique that's primary. George. Yes, George. This would make sense as an example of fear. Again, that's not the primary technique, but those are smart examples, right? Those do seem to be playing a role. George? Okay. This is not an appeal to ignorance. Appeal to ignorance is the most common guess that I see when I give these quizzes or these examples. Now, let me clarify what an appeal to ignorance is. If you have an author of an argument that is a big dummy, you do not call it an appeal to ignorance, right? Their stupidity has likely led to them to make other problems. An appeal to ignorance is when the author, the arguer, uses something unknown as if that should count as evidence for their conclusion. So if they say, I have never seen China, so it must not exist, they're saying, because I haven't seen it, that's my reason to disbelieve it. Let's try one that George would want to give. Go ahead, George. Yes, we haven't seen Jeff's brain, therefore he probably doesn't have one. Again, the lack of evidence there is given as evidence. Something we're ignorant of is supposed to give us a reason to believe something. Great example. Eyeleen? Yep, that's it. This is a hasty generalization. Now, let's do a little tangent here. As you know by now, and especially if you watch the first video, the main problem with fallacies, when we think of what makes an argument strong, so review what the idea of I was. In the I reading, we found that a strong argument will have relevant premises, truthful premises, and also have enough premises, enough evidence in those premises. Well, most fallacies will fail because of relevance. A hasty generalization fails for another reason. What is it? Insufficient evidence, right? There might be some relevant evidence, but we need a lot more. That's why we accuse it of being a hasty generalization. So in this case, right, we look at this and say, only 2 examples? There could be many other reasons for the, forgive me, shrunken junk. That doesn't seem like enough evidence, especially if thousands of people use that workout supplement and their junk, is just fine. Next, example D. The death penalty is morally fine because murderers deserve to be killed. This is a really tricky example, right? So if you've tried this and racked your brain for a while, this is one of the tougher ones. What is it, Eyeleen? Yes, right. That is impressive. This is begging the question, or another name for it is circular reasoning. If you look at this, right, each of the premise and the conclusion are really based on the same basic opinion. So instead of giving new reasons to believe those opinions, they just kind of use them in a circle. So we can think of it this way. The death penalty is morally fine. Well, why is it morally fine? Because murderers deserve to be killed. Okay, but why do murderers deserve to be killed? Well, because the death penalty is morally fine. Again, that one is tricky, right? But it's begging the question or arguing in a circle. You could say, for example, that D has suppressed evidence or a proof surrogate. Those often sound similar to begs a question, so that would be a very forgivable mistake, but begs a question, circular reasoning, those are the same thing, would get full credit with just the one fallacy. Example E. The animal rights people shouldn't pick on rodeos. If they've come out and see the way the clowns put smiles on the kids' faces and the determination it takes to ride the broncos or rope the hogs, they change their minds. George? Okay. I can see why you would think that this is a hasty generalization, but let me show you why it's subtly not that technique. In a hasty generalization, you have some evidence that might be relevant, but you need a lot more for the conclusion. It's a big general conclusion, and you only have a tiny bit of evidence. Well, in this case, it's not the issue where having more of this kind of evidence would help. It's a different problem. Eyeleen. Yes, so this case is a red herring. The author has quite literally changed the subject. Let me give a terrible analogy, right? So let me use an analogy for this and see if you can detect the same technique being used. Let's say I'm making an argument for why child abuse isn't so bad. And then I say this, here's why child abuse isn't so bad. If you saw the strength and techniques I use when I beat my kids and the smiles it puts on my wife and I's faces, then you would see that people shouldn't pick on my child abuse. Please forgive that crazy example, but do you hear it? That is the kind of evidence given for animal rights. It actually had very little to do with animal rights. Instead, they changed the subject and talked about how great the cowboys are, right? And how happy it makes the kids when they see these rodeos. So in this case, red herring, this is another one of those few cases where red herring would have gotten you the full credit. The other techniques aren't really playing a role here in example E. Okay, I hope this is working. I cannot believe I'm doing this way. Blame my daughter. She thought this would be a great idea. Okay, let's continue. Example F. Women definitely hate this shirt. Just the other day, I was wearing this shirt while I was trying to pick up on this hottie at a gynecologist office, and she wouldn't give me the time of day. George? No, George, this is an appeal to ignorance. Yes, this author is stupid, but that's not how an appeal to ignorance works. Good? Yeah, hasty generalization makes sense, right? We need to know a lot more before we would figure out if this is the shirt that's really to blame. That's not the primary technique, though, but that is a good guess. Good? Eyeleen? Yes, right? This is a false cause. In a false cause fallacy, it's where you provide a cause to explain what's happening, and clearly it's a very unlikely cause, right? Maybe the real cause is coincidence or something like this, but you posit something very far-fetched as if it's the cause. So, for example, let's give another example. The Lobos lost a basketball game last weekend because I wasn't wearing my red Lobos hat. Is that the real reason they lost? No, right? That's a weird superstition. That's not the real reason they lost. What is a better reason they lost? The other team might have played better, right? That's a much more likely explanation. Good. So, in this case, false cause would get you the bulk of the credit, and then saying something like hasty generalization is forgivable, but, sorry, George, appeal to ignorance is not at work here at all. So if you did some kind of random guess like that, you would lose a little bit of credit. Example G. Gus, I am not going to take your advice on my philosophy assignment. You failed the class 7 times. And yes, that was $10 on pump 4, please. George? Unqualified authority makes sense, but if you look at it, this one is actually reversed. In an appeal to unqualified authority, you are treating someone as if they're an expert when they're really not. So if I say, Hanes makes the best t-shirts because Michael Jordan said so, Michael Jordan isn't a t-shirt expert. I'm treating him as if he is just because he's famous. That's an appeal to unqualified authority. So now think what it would mean to have a reverse of that technique. Eyeleen? Yes, right? This is an ad hominem, right? Ad hominem is one of the few fallacies that I leave in Latin because it is so well known. You will find throughout these examples, your English teachers, I guess they love Latin more than I do, they tend to leave things in their Latin names. Instead of red herring, they'll say non sequitur and things like this. But this one is a pretty common phrase. So ad hominem, attacking the person instead of their issue or argument. Yes? Yes, Eyeleen. The secondary technique here is innuendo. It's really subtle, so that's impressive, but it's in that second sentence. Yes, that was $10 on pump 4, please. Notice. Now, if they're literally at a gas station and he just happens to be asking for $10 on pump 4, then it's literal. But I think most of us are understanding it as, in this case, the pump 4, please, is being used as an indirect put down. That's what an innuendo is. So if I am grading G, ad hominem will get the bulk of the credit. And in this case, innuendo is so subtle that I don't think I would expect it, right? So I would give the full credit to ad hominem. Innuendo is impressive, though. I think it's playing a role, but I can't be sure that everyone's going to read that as figurative, $10 on pump 4 and please, and not literal just by coincidence, right? So I would be forgiving there. Example H. In example H, I have never seen God, so he must not exist. George, this is yours. No, I am so sorry, George. This is not a black and white fallacy. It might look a little that way, but if we think of the issues of whether God exists or not, it's really not a gray issue. Existence is a yes or no question, so this one does admit of just two options, God existing or not. So, now to be nice, this is another one of the more difficult examples. Eyeleen? Yes. Darn it, George, I thought you had this one. This is an appeal to ignorance, right? So finally we found one. They're fairly rare, but notice what it's doing. It is saying, because I haven't seen God, therefore God doesn't exist. The lack of knowledge, the lack of information is used as evidence. So in this case, again, one of those cases where appeal to ignorance is the major and only technique, that would get you full credit. Example I. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because we take these truths to be self-evident. The documents later say endowed by their creator and so forth. Right. So this is a possible fallacy in one of our founding documents. Good. George. Appeal to popularity is not really what's happening here. Now, it is a completely forgivable guess. I wouldn't count it against you at all, because it does say everyone has these rights, and it also says we take these truths, and so it almost sounds like the argument is based on other people believing this. That makes sense. It's a good guess, but the technique is more particular. Yes, Eyeleen, it is suppressed evidence. Notice the way it uses everyone and says the phrase self-evident. Now, what does self-evident mean? It basically means this is obvious. Well, saying something is obvious isn't really giving you evidence unless the thing really is truly obvious. But we'd have to ask, are those rights absolutely obvious? Not that obvious when you consider that these people who wrote this document owned slaves and so forth. But we'll get to the relevance of it in part 2. But for now, that is a suppressed evidence, also known as a proof surrogate. We can use those terms interchangeably. That is the primary technique and the sole major technique in that case. That would get you full credit. Example J. Jim Caviezel, star of The Passion of the Christ, supports the U.S.'s unflinching pro-Israel stance, and that guy knows more than anyone else what Jesus would do in the Middle East today. George? It's not really attacking Jim Caviezel in that sense in this case, so think of reversing it. Eyeleen? Yes, right. This is an appeal to unqualified authority. Because he's an actor, that is acting as if that makes him an expert on something, because he's famous, because he played a role. George? Yes. I would give a little credit if you said hyperbole, because listen to the language. That guy knows more than anyone else. That is an incredible exaggeration said about just about anybody. Appeal to unqualified authority, the major technique. Hyperbole would get you a little more credit. Appeal to unqualified authority is the main thing going on there. Example K. Jeff wants us to stop focusing our life goals around money, so he wants us all to be homeless beggars. Eyeleen? Yes, this is a straw man. Now, think about this. All sorts of crazy stuff Jeff might say. Is it really my position that I want you all to be homeless beggars, or is that a ridiculous summary of my actual position? That's the idea of a straw man. George? Black and white, fear. Yeah, those are forgivable guesses, right? Let me think if those are really playing a role here. They're subtle. I don't think they're obvious. I think the fear would deserve a little credit. But clearly the primary technique is straw man, and I would give a little credit to either black and white or fear in that case. Good? Example L. During World War II, the U.S. government resettled many people of Japanese ancestry into internment camps. We sure have a generous government. Now, this example has an interesting history. Before, I used to give this example without that second sentence. We sure have a generous government. And very few people found anything wrong with the first sentence. And that's fairly scary. Good? What's going on here, Eyeleen? Yes. This is a euphemism. They are using words to change the meanings or how a reader would understand their claims. And if you think about it, there are 3 euphemisms here. Now, of course, we're used to hearing this language. This is how every country writes its own history. But see if you can find them. What are they? Resettled? When we think of resettling, we think of, I'm going to move to a different place because I got a new job. Is that what happened to the people of Japanese ancestry? No, that would be kidnapping and imprisonment, not resettling. And yes, the last 2 words of that sentence are also euphemistic. Internment, right? That makes you think of it's an internship, like they're just being an intern. And then the last one, and we're completely used to this euphemism, camps. Are they going on walks in the forest, setting up tents, making lanyards, and roasting s'mores over the campfire? No, these aren't camps. These are prisons, right? That's another euphemism. Good. So in this case, euphemism, full credit. M, one of my favorites. You are such a stud, so you should definitely test drive one of our power trucks. Good? Yes, this is flattery. Pretty easy example, right? They are talking about how great this person is instead of talking about what they should be talking about, which is the truck or what the person's needs are for a vehicle. Now, some fallacies often occur together, right? So appeals to popularity are sometimes also suppressed evidence. In this case, an appeal to flattery is automatically another fallacy as well. Red herring. Notice, it is a red herring because it's changed the subject. It's talking about flattery instead of the topic it should be talking about. Guys? That is pretty bright, right? I don't expect most people to see that, but yes, you could see a weak analogy here. But most people are so used to this word, they don't even see it, but it calls the person a stud. If you don't know the origins of that word, a stud is a horse used just for reproduction. So it's a procreative horse, and that's how you compliment a man for being big and strong. You say he's a horse that humps other horses for a living. I don't know why that's flattery, but we have a weird language. N. We should get some ice cream from Jack's Parlor because that old guy is very friendly and rarely gets any business now that those 3 Starbucks moved in down the street. This one I think is pretty clear. We're getting good at this. Yes, this is pity, similar to flattery. And so what does that do? It also makes it a red herring. We've changed the subject into talking about the person and why we should feel sorry for them. Example O. The tax system in this country is unfair. Just ask anyone. Now, I kind of coached you a couple examples ago for here. What is this? Appeal to popularity and suppressed evidence. Instead of telling us what people actually think, it just says everyone agrees, just ask anyone. So popularity, appeal to popularity would get you the bulk of the credit. Suppressed evidence would get you the last bit of the credit. And finally, example P, you should get a health exam or you may die of cancer that could be treatable. This, yes, appeal to fear. You could also say it's a red herring, but appeal to fear does most of the work. The other smart thing you could say is, no, George, this isn't an appeal to ignorance, right? We've gone over this. Eyeleen? Yes, you could see this as a hasty generalization. We need a lot more information. All right, I hope you did well. So next we will turn to part 2, where we articulate the relevance of these fallacies in the examples we just covered. So we are now on to the J exercises part 2, where we articulate the relevance of the examples. So have in front of you the J exercises and your answers, right? So we can go through it and get good at this. The main tip before we begin is don't get sidetracked by the truthfulness of the support. Make sure you're staying focused on the relevant. In your brain, focus first on what is the conclusion, and so what is the support, and just keep asking yourself, does that work as support, or does the fallacies we did in part 1, does that ruin the relevance as support? And then what I will do is I will give a solid answer that would get full credit that I would expect most people would get. And then I'll also give my own personal answer to show you that there are other possible ways to think about this. And of course, I think you will find my inventing these controversies pretty fun. When we have the big quiz note for the fallacies part, a big part of the credit will be from what we call part 1, listing the possible fallacies, making sure you get the primary fallacy, and then finding the secondary ones if they're there. When it comes to the second part, articulating relevance, please note that the score doesn't come from you saying whether it's relevant or not. The score comes from you justifying that relevance. So your explanation for why it's relevant or not. It's the explanation that gets you the credit, not just telling me how relevant it is. So example A. Again, using our standard little paradigm, the conclusion that should be supported is everyone should support the death penalty. So does the black and white fallacy ruin that support? A solid answer would be to say that this has almost no relevance, right? This is a complete black and white fallacy, right? There are plenty of other options besides killing them and letting them go kill some more. We could have lifetime sentences. You could have forced lobotomies. My own answer, I would say, I think there's some, or at least a little bit of relevance here, because we do have to worry about repeat offenses. B, the conclusion here is that this is going too far, and, right, this fear of what's going to happen next with our smoking rights is supposed to be the support. So we ask, right, does that work as support, or does this slippery slope and fear ruin it? A good common answer would be there's a little bit of support here, but it's overstated, right? There's no reason to be that much afraid the government is going to watch us in our homes. My own answer, though, is that this is mostly or maybe even completely relevant because this slippery slope accusation doesn't fit here. The idea of a slippery slope is that the first cause has very little relationship to the further actions that we need to be afraid of. But I think in this case, I think the chain of events are based on the same cause. Why is there a smoking ban in restaurants? Because of the dangers of secondhand smoke. Why could parents be liable? Because of the dangers of secondhand smoke. And actually, you will find that there are laws like this on the books in different states. C, the conclusion, I won't try that workout supplement, is that supported well by two guys took that and their junk shriveled, or does the hasty generalization ruin it? I'm assuming that most people will think this has no relevance, or maybe tiny relevance, because you will argue, and this sounds smart, that's two people out of the maybe thousands of people that use it. But my answer, I think this is mostly or maybe even completely relevant. Let me explain. When it comes to something being hasty, it depends on how important or how big the generalization is. But in this case, I don't think this is overgeneral because, no offense, but junk is a pretty important organ, and I don't need a lot of good reasons to take a different supplement or to not take one at all. So I think this is very relevant. Even if I just hear of one person out of thousands who have this problem, I don't need good reasons not to take a supplement. It's a very trivial thing to take one as opposed to the others, or stop taking them altogether. So I don't think the conclusion is too general, so it doesn't need that much evidence. Indeed, the conclusion is the death penalty is morally fine, and does begging the question ruin this evidence that murderers deserve to be killed? I think most people would think that there is some relevance here. I have a hard time seeing it, but what's going on is in your brain, you're filling in the evidence that isn't provided. Most people hear that and they say, well, of course murderers deserve to be killed because of eye for an eye justice or something like that. Now notice, that would be a decent argument, but the argument here doesn't say that. It begs the question by not bringing in any justification like eye for an eye. So I think there's almost no relevance here. I don't see anything but circularity and repeating the same opinion twice. E, the conclusion is that animal rights people shouldn't pick on rodeos, and we want to see if these smiling faces and the determination it takes to ride the broncos and rope the hogs is good evidence, or is it ruined by the red herring? Here, I don't see two possible answers. It is a pure red herring. Those have nothing to do with animal rights. So, one answer, no relevance. The support here has nothing to do with animal rights. It completely changes the subject. Example F. Conclusion. Women definitely hate this shirt, and the reason given is that women at the gyno office wouldn't give him the time of day. Now, I think many people, and this is a good answer, would say there's no relevance. It's clearly this guy has no game. Who would pick up on women at a gynecological office? This guy's a loser. My answer, though, is some or tiny relevance. I'm sorry, I'm going to goof off again, but there could be something to this shirt. Right now, imagine, are there truly offensive shirts that would completely turn off women to this guy? Sure, right? Think of them. I've seen this shirt out there. It says, quote, "Free gynecological exams, meet me in my van." That would be an offensive shirt. Or maybe we can go with the standard mesh tank top with the chest hair sticking out of it. How about the Hawaiian shirt with the medallion and button down to here? Could be something to do with the shirt. Example G. The conclusion that I am not going to take Gus's advice on my philosophy assignment, is this supported by his failing, or is this an ad hominem? I think most people would argue that this is not an ad hominem at all. This has complete relevance. If he failed, we shouldn't take his advice. That's a good, relevant reason for not taking his advice. I would argue, though, that it's mostly relevant, but I think the attack might be a little too harsh because, seriously, he's taken the class that many times. He at least knows how to fail. So listen to his advice, and do the opposite. Example H. The conclusion, God must not exist. The support, because I haven't seen him. Is this workable support, or does the appeal to ignorance ruin this argument? I think most people would say there could be a wide range of answers on one like this. I think the most common answer would be, this is mostly relevant, because having not seen something can be good evidence that it doesn't exist, and most people hear the word seen in this example and think of not directly seeing God, but I don't see evidence for God, and so this makes sense for not believing in something that you don't see any evidence for. I would argue, though, my personal answer would be, this has no relevance because it's simply a category mistake. You don't look for seen things when you're talking about something unseen. God is by definition invisible. So this, in my estimation, would be like arguing there's no oxygen in this room because I can't see it. No, you can't see oxygen. It's invisible. Example I. The conclusion is, that we have these rights, and the evidence is that it's obvious. I think a common answer would be that this is mostly relevant because rights should be obvious to anyone. The rights to life, that should make total sense, so self-evidence is there. We do see that these rights are obvious. I would argue, though, that it's only somewhat relevant because I don't think these rights are obvious to most people. I think, for example, historically, slavery, how women were treated, show that these rights aren't obvious. And, take the right to life. We have a country, the United States, that doesn't think healthcare is a basic right, where other countries would say it's obvious if you have a right to life, then the government should promote healthcare. See, so I don't think it's obvious. Example J. The argument is stating support for the U.S.'s unflinching stance, and it gives Jim Caviezel's support for that stance as an argument. I think most people would say that there is no relevance here. I think you could give a solid answer than saying appealing to his unqualified authority is silly. He's just an actor. What does he know about this stuff? I would argue, though, and I think some of you would, that there is some relevance here. Sure, this is mostly an appeal to unqualified authority, but I think anyone could study anything. And maybe this actor, Jim Caviezel, is such a serious actor that he studies everything about the part, including the issues of foreign policy and the politics of Israel. Who knows? Anyone could study anything, so there could be a little bit of authority hidden in this actor. Example K. So example K is arguing that Jeff has this ridiculous position. He wants us all to be homeless beggars. I think most people would answer, and this is a solid answer, that there's no relevance here. That's not Jeff's position at all. But I think there's also a solid answer could be saying that there's some relevance here. It could be an issue that Jeff's argument is a little overstated. we should worry about money a little. Jeff saying we should stop focusing on money. Of course, his real position is we should find something we're interested in, try to meet our needs through our work and stuff like that. But it is relevant to say that we should show some concern about money. Example L. The conclusion that our government is generous and kind or something like that, and then the possible euphemisms. So the issue here is not, are these relevant? The issue is, how misleading are the euphemisms? A common answer, I think, would be that we are not misled by these euphemisms. We know that people talk this way about their history, and so it's not misleading. But I would argue, again, the former answer is a solid answer, but I would argue that these are purposely misleading, that we do get completely the wrong idea about these historical events, so I think there's a good argument either side. Example N. The conclusion that you should test drive one of these trucks, the support is you're a stud. I think most people would argue very well that this has no relevance. They change the subject completely into flattery, and they're just flattering the guy instead of talking about what kind of truck it is or what his needs in a truck are. Great. I, though, am going to try to piss you off and argue that this is mostly relevant, or at least somewhat relevant. Because purchasing, for most people, is a very emotional interaction. And what are we talking about? Power trucks. Do people buy power trucks mostly because of their utility or because they want to feel big and strong? I would argue that at least half of the people buy cars, power trucks, sports cars especially, because of how they make us feel about ourselves. So I think, here, let me give you a weird analogy that you won't like. Let's say that you are at a store and you try on some jeans. You come out of the dressing room and the salesperson says, forgive me for this, "Oh my gosh, your butt looks so cute in those jeans." Are you more likely to keep looking at those jeans and maybe even buying them because of the flattery? Because that's why we often buy products, because we want to feel good about ourselves. I think there's a lot of relevance in flattery when it comes to at least test driving a truck, maybe even buying it. Example N. We should get some ice cream from Jack's Parlor because we feel sorry for that nice guy. Most people will argue pity here is almost completely a fallacy because we didn't even talk about, does he have good ice cream, right? What is the service like? What are the prices like? These things would be relevant reasons. Great answer. But I would think another great answer would be that this is mostly or maybe even completely relevant. Him being a nice guy and feeling sorry for him, to me, is a perfectly good reason for shopping at his place. As long as his ice cream's okay, I just like supporting nice people. Example O. The conclusion the tax system in this country is unfair is supported with everybody thinks so. The typical answer, yes, is that the appeal to popularity ruins this argument. It has almost no relevance because people are so stupid and you can't judge popular opinion as the best way for evidence. That is a solid answer, but I would argue that this has some relevance, or is at least a little relevant. If people genuinely don't like their tax system, that's a good reason to at least look into it being unfair. Now, let me give some perspective. Most Americans think that everyone hates taxes. But if we look at other countries, especially other countries that have much higher tax rates than we do, they don't all hate their taxes because they see what it's spent on. For example, if you're in Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Japan, right, Australia, you would say, look at our roads, look at our healthcare system that our taxes paid for, look at our universities that are free, and they would say, taxes are fair. So I think that the relevance is not, obviously none. I think there's some or a lot of relevance in asking the population what they think of the taxes. Finally, example P. The argument is for you should get a health exam, and the reason given is you could die of cancer that could be prevented. I think most people would argue that this is mostly relevant, that that's a good reason, but the fear, right, is a bit exaggerated. I would argue this is completely relevant. It just says you may die of cancer that could be prevented. Perfectly good reason to get a health exam.